Thank you. Hello everybody and welcome to this session. We're going to look at this evening the human impact on the environment, and the areas we're going to look at, we're going to look at what we know from GCSE and AS in terms of our impact on the environment. We're going to develop an understanding of our terminology for A2 relating to human impact on the environment, and you will notice from looking at this topic, if you've studied it already, that there is a lot of terminology, and it is just a case of learning these terms and thinking of examples and adding as much detail as you can to your answer. So we'll look at perhaps some ways that we can do that and think about some ways that we can learn these terms so that we get them firmly implanted in our heads, so that when we do have a look at some exam questions later on in this session, we are able to answer them very accurately. And then finally, which I've just already told us, we're going to have a look at some exam questions on human impact on the environment to see how we get on. Now, I'm going to start by showing a little film, so hopefully this will work through this Teams forum here and through this recording, but this is a film I've made that I want you to think about the images that it shows us in this film, and I want you to have a think about what it's telling us, what it's doing, thinking about the impact that we are having on our environment as you watch this. Okay, so it's a couple of minutes long, so just have a think and watch it as we look at it. Okay, so hopefully that played okay for everybody, and you can see there were a lot of images in that film that were quite pertinent to this topic. And certainly if you picked on towards the start, where you could see deforestation taking place and the big map pin that landed there where logging was taking place, that's a particular area that we need to be aware of in this unit of work. So deforestation is a massive problem, and you can see that there are lots of things there that are linked to this topic in terms of how we behave and how humans impact on our environment. So we're going to have a look at some of these key terms that are words and phrases that we need to be familiar with in this topic, and obviously we need to be able to be using these terms fluently when we are answering our exam questions, and have a think really of a good way to learn these terms so that you are familiar and fluent with them. So it could be, for example, whether you make some flashcards with the term on one side and the definition on the other to give you some experience of using them and test yourself regularly on that. You could make a mind map with pictures and lots of colours to emphasise these key terms, and use the pictures so that you know what the word means, to give you that extra mental picture really to explain those words. So let's have a look at our first set of terms here. So we've got conservation, deforestation, endangered and extinction. So it's about making sure that we are clear that conservation is when we maintain an ecosystem, so keep a particular area in its natural state, where we conserve and protect the level of biodiversity there, and it's us as humans that do that. We carry out conservation, and we carry out conservation in a number of different ways, whether it's a project, whether it's based on laws that we implement. So there are lots of different ways, and we'll look at some of those ways later in this session. When conservation is carried out, it is important that we preserve the gene pool, so we keep the genetic information and the genetic information of that population within that particular ecosystem is kept as it should be. So moving on, we look at deforestation, and this is when trees are removed and the subsequent problems from that, and removing of trees from a particular area, and then that area is used to grow crops or support cattle. And what are the problems with deforestation? Trees and their roots are very good at anchoring the soil, and the problem is with deforestation, as trees are taken away, then that soil has nothing to keep it there. So as it rains over a period of time, then that can wash away the topsoil, so it becomes less effective at supporting cattle, and it becomes nutrient depleted, so it is more difficult to grow crops. Moving on, if we look at endangered species, this is linked a little to extinction. So endangered species are almost, but not quite, at the level of extinction that some organisms might be. So they are damaged, if you like, in terms of numbers. It might be that they are at risk of extinction because there has been a change to their habitat, or there has been a decrease in their population. If there has been a change in their population, perhaps due to pollution levels or due to deforestation, for example, then they are endangered organisms on that list. Extinction means that there is death for all living members of a particular species, so they are no longer in existence. So let's look at our second set of terms, and at any time that you feel like you want to pause this film, do so and just make a note of the terms in each of these little sections. Okay, so we're looking at now agricultural exploitation, fish farming and overfishing, which are three terms really that are linked together. So agricultural exploitation, as the name suggests, anything to do with exploitation, is when we try to increase the efficiency and the intensity of food production to meet a demand, and the demand is to produce more food for a growing population. But of course that has problems then when we try to cram too much into a particular area. Fish farming is when we breed fish in an enclosure to avoid overfishing, and overfishing is when we carry out too much fishing or overfish, excessive fishing in an area, and we can't replenish that naturally. So fish farming and overfishing are two terms that work together. So fish farming, we are breeding in enclosures so that we have fish available to support our population's needs. Overfishing is when there is too much fishing taking place and that overtakes the natural replenishment that we have in a particular natural environment. So moving on, we've got the gene pool, sustainable and planetary boundaries. So the gene pool is important. That refers to all the different versions of a gene or alleles that we have within a particular population. And that's why those alleles and that frequency of those genes needs to be maintained to ensure that biodiversity and the ecosystem is conserved, which then links us to sustainable, which is that idea that we maintain an ecosystem and keep it running for the future. And then finally, in this particular section, we've got the idea of planetary boundaries. And these are 9 limits really that have been proposed by scientists and earth scientists. And we'll look at these in a little bit more detail later, but it's where scientists have put a limit on these particular regions and which human activity can take place, but only without irreversible damage to the environment. So we're going to move on. And have a look at this organism. Now, that sound is the sound of the dodo, what scientists believe that the dodo sounded like. And you can see, as we know, the dodo is extinct. And we know this definition now, and this is a key definition really that you might want to make sure that you make a note of. So extinction, which means that no remaining individuals of a species are alive. And there are 2 main organisations or tenets really that we work by as scientists. And we've got CITES and we've got the IUCN, so the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and then we've got the Convention for International Trade in Endangered Species, which refers to flora and fauna. And it's these 2 organisations and their work and the regulations that they put down enable us to support and manage conservation of organisms in their environments and in their ecosystems. Now, the dodo we know is extinct, and it lived in Mauritius. A bit of background information about it as an organism, and what we were traditionally led to believe was that as sailors were travelling and discovering islands, that they went on to Mauritius and damaged the dodo population. They killed the dodo and brought those specimens back. But it wasn't just the action of sailors who were visiting Mauritius, it was also the rats on the ships as well. And what they did when they left the ship, when they reached the land of the islands, they took the eggs of the dodo and ate them, and they also ate the young of the dodo. So there was quite an impact on that particular species at that time. So here then, the International Union for Conservation of Nature makes a list, and it's called the Red List. And what they do, they update this list annually, and they put on there the list of species that are threatened, and they classify species as to whether they are vulnerable, whether they are endangered, or whether they are critically endangered. And then from that, CITES works with this information that is on the IUCN list. And the idea then with CITES is that they look at the trade in organisms and products from organisms based on the threat level that has been guided by the IUCN Red List. And CITES produces 3 different appendices. So Appendix 1, so any animal or plant or organism that is on Appendix 1, there is absolutely no trade at all in that organism. For Appendix 2, there are very strict controls on the trade. And then in Appendix 3, there are strict controls on trade of certain populations of a species. So that's the law and the official side of what we can do to reduce extinction of organisms. And the causes of extinction, we'll just have a look at some of these ideas now. So at any time, don't forget to pause the film and have a look, and we'll discuss these areas now that may cause extinction. So if a new predator moves into an area, that might lead to a change in an environment or in the ecosystem. So as predators move in, then they are going to take away that particular organism from an environment that it lives in. So a new predator will lead to a reduction in a species. And it could be that there is one or more of these particular situations that might lead to extinction taking place. So as we know, certainly over the last couple of years, new diseases are coming to the forefront more and more, and it may be that a new mutation or a mutation takes place that causes a new disease to be more prevalent in a particular ecosystem. And again, if an organism cannot adapt fast enough to withstand that disease, then they may become extinct. Similarly, if we look at new competitors, if there is a new competitor in a particular environment, they are competing and working against the organism to get hold of their food or their nesting site. And of course, if an organism can't get their food, then there is a problem in terms of their energy and therefore the amount of energy they have for reproduction. Similarly, if they are competing for nesting sites and out-competing the original organism, then of course then that can be a cause of extinction as well. Natural disasters. We saw in the film at the start that global warming is leading to changes in weather patterns, and that, coupled with climate change, both of these aspects may cause extinction for organisms. So as climate increases in terms of temperature change, as there are perhaps windier weather or colder weather, then this means that organisms that had previously been able to survive in their normal narrow parameters are now not able to survive. And therefore, if they're not able to survive, they can't reproduce, they can't pass on their genes, and so extinction is probable for these organisms, unfortunately. And then finally, speciation. So as species drift away, and if, for example, there's a mutation and different species form, then again, this means that the previous species, if you like, becomes extinct and is no longer able to be supported in a particular habitat or environment. Okay, so what can we do to look at in terms of conservation? And this is the next area that we're going to think about and look at the different types of conservation. And there are two types of conservation. There's ex situ and there's in situ. And we're going to look at these examples now. We're going to look at the advantages and the disadvantages. And this is an area that might be a question where you need to think about and to look at the advantages of conservation ex situ and the disadvantages as well. So we'll have a look at both of these, and the idea might be for you to try and construct an argument. And if you've ever looked at any work that's called a fishbone diagram, where you've got the advantages that you label at the top and then the disadvantages that you label at the bottom, you start with your introductory paragraph, you end with your summary, and that is quite a good way for you to compare the advantages and disadvantages of a particular topic. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these areas in terms of the advantages of conservation ex situ. So it can be very rapid, And the idea then, if it's very quickly done, then that can prevent extinction. And it can bring back an organism that may be on the edge of extinction. So think about when we talked about those organisms that are on the IUCN list. So those that are just pre-extinction there can be brought back from extinction. We can try and maintain genetic diversity. If then we look at the next particular advantage, so if we take any organism, we can use that for research and we can use that for education. So the idea of conservation ex situ is that we are looking at organisms or carrying out conservation away from the particular area where there is an issue. So we are taking animals or we are taking samples away from their particular area. So we are not carrying out conservation at the site, and that's what in situ conservation is, and we'll look at that shortly. So at ex situ conservation, we can carry out that process very rapidly to increase numbers. So if a group of organisms are threatened, then we can increase the numbers rapidly with a breeding programme. We can also look after plants ex situ in terms of conservation, and we can collect seeds and produce a seed bank. That takes up less room than if we are trying to grow the plants from seed in fields in their native environment. So if we collect the seeds and keep them, if the seeds then are kept, they are dormant. So that means that they are not actively germinating, and we have them with us, and that reduces any damage. So that means that we are protecting those seeds for future generations. So let's look at the disadvantages now of conservation ex situ. So if we do carry out conservation ex situ, we might want to reintroduce an organism back into its native environment. So we might see an organism that is dwindling in numbers, we take it out, we increase the numbers of that by a breeding programme, and then we want to reintroduce it. And there are a number of issues here that we can see. Breeding programmes are expensive, they are difficult to carry out. If you think about the panda, for example, that is removed, they are quite difficult to breed from. It's certainly very expensive to breed, very difficult, very time consuming, and then trying to reintroduce them back into their native environment can be very difficult. So there are certainly issues surrounding that. When we mentioned the seeds and the storage of seeds earlier, and we said that it was useful to store the seeds, but there is a space, there's a limit in terms of the amount of seeds that can be stored. So we can't store every single seed that we might need to, and also there is a time limit in terms of how those seeds may be stored, for what length of time. And if seeds are being protected in ex situ conservation, then there may be a change there in that particular environment that they are being protected in. There, I've said that they could be damaged through power cuts, so that could be a problem as well. There's also the idea that wild populations, so if we try and conserve outside of the native environment, then that's reducing the population of organisms in their native environment. So we take them out, you can see there that we're exploiting the animal, and we're also not conserving in situ, so we're reducing that wild population. So two further examples there of ex situ conservation disadvantages. So let's look at in situ conservation, and that's where we might have, for example, conservation in a particular area. So it might be a national park, it might be a SSSI, so a site of special scientific interest, and the activities that take place there are monitored very carefully, and the activities that take place there are sustainable, and that means that any damage to that particular habitat or environment is minimal, and it means that organisms are protected. So let's have a look at some of the advantages here. So biodiversity is protected, and biodiversity is a big thing really within a habitat. We recover viable populations in their native habitats, so we don't have to worry about trying to reintegrate and the finance and the difficulties surrounding that. Those animals that are conserved in situ can recover more quickly. Biodiversity is protected, so the wide variety of living things that we have in a particular habitat is protected, it's maintained. So if any trees, for example, are cut down, then they are replanted. So the whole idea of conservation in situ protects that area. And then those examples of ecosystems are also protected. So there are lots of different ecosystems that we need to protect. And by carrying out conservation in situ, we can do that. But there are disadvantages to that. So let's have a look at some of the disadvantages. So by conservation in situ, we might not have enough work to remove the problem. So if there is a disease in a particular area, then we might not be able to remove the disease. And then of course that can cause a problem still. If we don't carry out conservation fast enough, then that means that the genetic diversity within that particular area decreases. And that means there is a problem then for those organisms in terms of reproduction and in terms of then possible extinction. Okay, so this image and that sound effect bring to life the idea of overfishing, which is another area that we need to have a think about and a focus on within this particular unit on human impact on the environment. So what do we do? What are the problems with fishing? And this is one of those areas, in order to be successful in your exam, that it's just a case of learning the problem, learning what we can do to control, and then putting that into your answer to make sure that you've got enough detail to cover that. So what are the problems with overfishing? So one of the problems is that the global fishing fleet is too large. So we have too many boats carrying out fishing expeditions. It's just too big. Another problem is that we use all sorts of different technology to fish in our fishing fleet, and they don't just remove one species of fish, they just remove lots of different fish. And we use problems that can be with drift nets. We can use very small mesh sizes of net. We use massive ships that are like a factory that can collect a lot of fish at any one time, and also bottom trawling techniques where we go right along the bottom of the sea floor and collect as much as we can. So there are problems with the methodology in terms of our collection of fishing. And then finally, another problem is that we fish throughout the breeding season, so we don't have a break. That means that populations of fish cannot reproduce and repopulate because we don't ever stop fishing. So let's look at what we can do to control some of these issues that we've just mentioned to do with fishing. And again, this is an idea where look at the problem, look at the control measure and marry them up so that you've got an argument for the pros and cons of this and what we can do to manage this situation. So what can we do to control fishing? Well, we can make sure that we only fish at certain times of the year, so we don't fish in the breeding season, and that means that fish stocks can be replenished, that we need to restrict the size of mesh that we use, so make sure that we don't use those other methods that I mentioned earlier about the big massive factory ships, and we don't trawl along the bottom of the seabed, sorry. So we restrict our methods. So we use methods for catching fish that are not damaging to the population as a whole. Obviously, we don't fish endangered species, so we make sure that we only fish those fish that we are allowed to catch. And also, finally, we stick to a quota. So quotas are numbers of fish that we are allowed to catch. And if we go above that level, then we have to put the fish back. So it's about sticking to that and making sure that we do all of those things to control fish numbers, to avoid overfishing. Okay, let's look then at this idea of planetary boundaries. Now, these are areas, really, the ranges of safe operating levels on 9 different areas that have been put forward by Earth scientists. And these are areas that may bring about a change in our global environment. And these were put forward in 2009 to enable us to not put our Earth in a damaging position. Okay, so let's look at some of these now. Okay, so climate change, and some of these are things that we've mentioned already this evening. Some of them were in the film, which we watched at the start as well. So it's just a case of making sure that you know what these 9 planetary boundaries are, and also just a reminder of what can happen if we move away from accepted levels. So what might happen if chemical pollution, for example, is too high? What impact does that have on biodiversity? And you can see that these are not discrete particular areas, that there is a linkage between them. If you think about atmospheric aerosols and ozone depletion, if you think about land use and how that can affect biodiversity as well. So just think about how we can link all this together, really, and think about population and our impact as humans on our environment. Okay, so let's think now about the future and sustainability, and what can we do to keep things stable. So you know, and you will be aware, that population globally is increasing. And as our population is increasing, what is that doing to our environment? We are consuming more resources, whether that's more energy, whether it's more food. We are having an impact. So the more the population increases, the more impact we are having on the availability of resources. So what can we do to mitigate that? We need to think about sustainability. We need to think about our attitude as humans, educate people so that we make the right decision for our particular environment, bearing in mind those particular 9 issues that we talked about earlier. And all of that leads to the decisions that are made by our governments around the world that should be based on sound scientific knowledge and sound scientific principles to enable us to move forward so that we are acting as custodians of our planet. Okay, we've just got a few minutes to have a look at an exam question. Now, it's quite a long question, so again, this might be a situation where you pause the film and take some time to read through the question. But the question here is about the Eurasian beaver, and it's a herbivorous mammal, and it was formerly native to the UK. They played an important part in our landscape by felling trees to build dams. These dams block small streams, which slows their flow and forms small small ponds and bogs. They were hunted to extinction, so we know that they were hunted and are no longer around in the 16th century. And because that species became extinct, that had an impact then on freshwater habitats. Because of their behaviour, they were able to maintain freshwater habitats, whereas because they were hunted to extinction, that changed. So this map here shows us some of the sites where beavers have been reintroduced, with some proposed sites as well. So here, that information here, and that's what we need to refer to when we look at these next few questions. So quite a straightforward question to start with. Beavers used to be endangered in Europe. Explain what is meant by an endangered species. So here's an opportunity to pause now, and then we'll have a look at what endangered means here in this context, and that is a species that is at risk of extinction. Okay, so one mark, very straightforward. Okay, endangered. Make sure that you know the difference between endangered and extinct. Okay, our next question. Give 2 advantages of using reintroduction of beavers from Northern Europe as a strategy for conservation in the UK. So this question is testing, first of all, our advantages of reintroducing beavers. So thinking about that information that we talked about earlier about conservation. Have a look. So we can see there's quite a lot of information here. So we can see here, so for example, it improves biodiversity. It might increase freshwater habitats. And we saw that in the written part, so it's a case of going back and rereading that information. Another example, it might be to reduce flooding. And because we're using beavers that are European, then this means that they are either well adapted to the environment, or in terms of our gene pool, we are using the correct genetics there to support that reintroduction. Now, the next question is about some reintroduction that's taken place, but some of it has been legal and illegal. So we need to think about the issues surrounding these. Give 2 reasons why people might be concerned about illegal and their unregulated introduction of beavers. Okay, so pause the film, have a think what 2 reasons there might be why people are concerned about that unregulated reintroduction of the beaver population. Okay, and they might, because they're not regulated, introduce disease, and that disease might cause a problem. If it wasn't the European beaver, then we can see here the wrong species might not be adapted to that environment as well as the European beaver would be. And also then another marking point here that it could lead to flooding and could affect the land use in that particular area where they are introduced. Moving on, conservation decisions, which I mentioned earlier, can be based on sound scientific principles. What 2 factors do we need to consider when planning the successful reintroduction of beavers? So we need to think about some species adaptations. If they can't adapt in a short period of time, then they might need to move to another habitat where they are adapted. And then also the human population there, if that is increased or industry is increased, can that cause environmental change? And then finally, 4 points here on this question: how biodiversity lost may be delayed. So how might the loss of biodiversity be delayed using suitable conservation methods? So these are some of the methods that we've talked about previously. So whether it's a gene bank or a sperm bank, breeding programs, talking about fishing. So this is quite a broad question here. Habitat destruction, SSIs, national parks as well, where we have monitoring of a particular conservation area. Okay, so there's plenty of ideas there for you to get your 4 marks on that question there. Finally, just a very short question here. Explain what a SSI is and why red kites may breed more successfully in these sites. So very straightforward, to cite a special scientific interest, and then the second marking point is to say that these areas are protected from development or any other damage. So thank you very much for listening through the presentation. Hope you found it useful,